There are two talks that I'll be giving. The second one will be the fiscal and regulatory incentives. The first one will be the vision for a CO2 supply system. So we've talked about the availability. I guess that's going to come up in a minute. We've talked about the availability of CO2, but we need to get the CO2 from the point sources of supply, which, as we were saying, fortunately, are few, and they're large sources. Thank you. And the distances are short. So basically, we're looking at Point Lisas and Point Fortin. Okay? That's what I'm trying. It is the right-hand button. If I turn it on, it works, right? Okay. I am glad that I am not the only person giving you these statistics, because people look at me and say, Krishna, you are too optimistic. I'm glad the engineers are giving numbers which are even higher than what I have been saying. So 3.5 billion barrels of oil have been produced to date. Most of it by primary recovery. You've heard from Mr. Abda today that basically 20% of the original oil in place in the country has been produced, so it's 80% left in the ground. You saw this slide, so I won't go into it again, but basically 1.5 billion barrels from land, 1 billion barrels from the Gulf of Paria, and 1 billion barrels from the East Coast province. EOR can recover another 30%. That will bring us up to 50%. I should mention that, that Norway, the government has a philosophy that they have mandated their regulatory and government agencies to ensure that the oil recovery of percentage in the country is not less than 55% of original oil in place, and to do what it takes to get that done. So people from the Ministry of Energy and the EMA and Bureau of Standards, that's where we should be looking at, 50 to 55% of original oil in place, and we should be looking to do what it takes. Mr. Abda showed you this slide already, and basically CO2 can take you from 20% to 55%. That's a relative number, so take that with a grain of salt. The costs are much lower than that. That's a more absolute number. So you're looking at 20% to as much as 55%. Why CO2? We've heard it this morning. It's a huge resource. We can use it to produce a lot of oil, and then we can sequester it. It is actually about 55%, I'm told, that stays in the ground, and about 45% that comes out. So, for CO2 to succeed, there are 5 steps. We need the fields. We need the CO2 supply. We need the expertise. We need the regulatory agencies. And we need the NGO. Sorry? This talk now is about step 2, the CO2 supply. I want you all to remember that with CO2 EOR or IOR, the footprint is actually smaller than natural gas. So in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, it's better to use oil from IOR, CO2, than natural gas. And I don't think Mr. Abda saw this, but the numbers are the same. 1 trillion cubic feet of CO2 that we can sequester. This is a map showing all the contiguous acreage of Trinidad and Tobago. This area is area which is prospective for oil and gas. This area is area within which oil and gas have been produced to date. A long-term vision is we have to have a pipeline system going from the point sources of CO2 to the oil fields. Now, I say oil fields, but actually, they could also go to the gas fields. We have not addressed that today, and that's not the topic of today's conversation, but new technology and new uses of old technology, people are starting to use CO2 to increase percentage of oil from natural gas reservoirs as well. So that when all our oil reservoirs have been depleted and the CO2 is in the reservoir, we can take it and then carry it to the natural gas reservoirs. So that's your vision. From point source A, point source B, to go, first of all, to the Gulf of Paria, then to the western onshore fields, then to the eastern onshore fields, and then to the eastern offshore oil fields, and up here. And from there, it's a small step to your gas fields. So, what do we do in the short term? It takes at least 18 months to 2 years, to my mind, to get up even the first phase of a pipeline system built. Because of the regulatory processes that need to be done, you need to look at EMA, you need to get, if you're going into the onshore, you need to get pipeline rights away, and you need to get pipelines laid. So what can you do in the short term? Very simple. You put a compressor at the site of one of the CO2 sources, and you get either buy or build a compressed CO2 tank truck, and you truck the compressed CO2 to the field. A simple way of doing it is you get a trailer, you put 3 or 4 joints of 36-inch casing, and you make up a trailer, which can take, and that can go up to 3,000 PSI. And then you truck that to the site. People are doing it in other places of the world, so there's no reason why it can't be done here. The beauty about that is that it's very quick. The longest time frame is to get a compressor ordered and brought into the country. If you can find a second-hand compressor or one off the shelf, then you're looking at 3 months. You can also look at it if it's an offshore field or a field which is bordering on a coastline, say in the Gulf of Paria. You do the same principle, but instead of putting it on a trailer and trucking it to the site, you put it on a barge and bring the barge to the site. Advantage of that is that can deliver you much larger quantities of CO2. Sorry. This is an illustration of a type of barge. This is a fairly large one, but you can do it on a smaller scale. And then we can go on to the pipeline system. Now, what I would like to do is to find a way that we kickstart the pipeline system by forming fairly early on in the piece a CO2 delivery company which applies for the regulatory approvals fairly early in the game, let's say within the next 3 months, so that by the time the need for the pipeline is there, the approvals are in place. Because as I see it, Petrotrin has said to us that within 6 to 9 months from now, well, more like 8 to 9 months from now, awards will be made to people who will be proposing or will have proposed to do EOR projects using CO2, and they are going to need a supply of CO2. And the sooner they get it, the better. But so, the first phase of a pipeline system would be taking into account the offerings that Petrotrin have been saying that they are going to make, which are, and I showed you in that slide, in a slide earlier this morning, main field, east field, and then just to the west here, the north field, and then the onshore fields, Point Fortin, Forest Reserve, Guapo, and Parilands. So phase one could be coming this way into the offshore, into the onshore, and there are two potential point sources. One is the ammonia plants, and two is right here in Point Fortin itself, of course, Atlantic LNG. Basically, we're looking at, to my mind, phase one of up to about 100 million cubic feet of CO2. Dr. Pudlal says he was quoting millions of metric tons, but that's equivalent to about, correct me if I'm wrong, about 300 million cubic feet of CO2 per day of basically pure CO2. So I'm saying 100 million, which is 1/3 of that availability. So it is doable. If we use it as the sole recovery agent, and we use the average that Mr. Abda was talking about, which is 5 MCF per barrel, you're looking at 20,000 barrels oil per day from 100 million. And that is not counting re-injected CO2. If you re-inject the CO2, that could go to 35,000 barrels oil per day. If you use CO2 alternating water, then that could go to even higher. And Donnie was talking about, 50,000 barrels of oil per day? And again, Clyde was not privy to this slide. He said 30 years, 1 TCF of CO2 can be sequestered. The engineers are agreeing with me. Then you can expand as time goes on to include all the onshore fields, and then you can even go into the East Coast areas. Worldwide, there's about 4 BCF of CO2 that's being injected into reservoirs today. If we use 2 BCF, and even you say 10 MCF per barrel, that's 200,000 barrels per day. Our peak production was 230,000 barrels per day. History has shown that for individual fields of normal oil, gravity, you can get up to 70 to 90% by EOR using CO2 of your peak oil production. This is telling us the same thing. And of course, by sequestering all the CO2, we could then drop down to one of the lowest emitters of CO2 in the world. So let's do this, like Mr. Abda said. We've been talking too long. We've been idle too long. So call me. I need help. I can't do it alone, or even with Clyde but helping me, two of us alone can't do it. So thank you for that, and then we will go straight on to the next talk, because it's not just you need to help us with this, the government and the regulatory agencies need to put things in place. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some economics and explain why we need changes in the fiscal and regulatory regimes. About a couple of months ago, David Rennick, in one of his columns, he said that, and he was quoting Dr. Sobers, who was here at the last seminar, who said pretty much the same thing, that with 100 million cubic feet of CO2, you should get at least 15,000 barrels of oil per day. But you could double that if you use a WAG process. I'm saying 20,000. Let's say we get 20,000 barrels per day, and we're using 100 million cubic feet of CO2 per day. Now, David Rennick also talked about the wonderful incentives that are in place, one of which was a 20% reduction in SPT for EOR projects. So I said to him two things. At current oil prices, which, as you know, are below $50, SPT is zero. So 20% is zero. In any event, the incentive only applies to oil of 18 degrees API and less. You will have seen from what Mr. Abda showed you today, those fields, the vast majority of the fields are actually higher than 18 degrees API. The onshore fields that are 18 degrees API or less, a lot of them have already had steam. Now, CO2 can be used afterwards, but it's a lot less than the total oil. So there are no incentives in place. So let's look at some economics based on CO2 EOR, and I want to look at two types of scenarios, one at $50 a barrel and one at $51 a barrel, because at $50.01 a barrel, SPT kicks in. So we're assuming that the capital cost of a EOR program capable of doing about 20,000 barrels a day is about $5 a barrel. They're looking at about 100 million US. I'm saying the cost of supplying CO2 to the field gate is about, well, to the field is about $1.75 per MCF. It could be less than that. It's unlikely to be more than that because of the differences that Clyde had been talking about. One is the cost of supply from the CO2 supplier should be less, and the distances are less. But in the States, you're looking at $3 an MCF, so we're looking at somewhere near half. In the cases of the Petrotrin offerings, I am assuming that Petrotrin is going to ask for a price. They're not going to give an oil company North Soldado for free. They're going to say, we want an overrider. This has been their practice in the past, and we expect it to continue. I'm saying 7.5%. It could be more, it could be less, but the economics are based on 7.5%. I am assuming two different scenarios, one offshore, one onshore, because your operating costs are less, and when SPT kicks in, your SPT regimes are different. I'm saying $17.50 per barrel and $23.50 per barrel. It could be less than that. It's unlikely to be higher than that. And we know what SPT is, onshore and offshore. And I'm saying that the operating costs are higher than what the current operating costs are because, Clyde pointed it out to you, EOR is intensive business. It demands a lot more work, and your operating costs are going to be higher. So I did eight cash flows, 4 at less than 50, some at $50 and some at 51. 4 or 2 onshore, 2 offshore. So that's 4. So if you look, and I do have the cash flows themselves, and these will be shared with you, but in the interest of time, there's no way I could have gone through those here. But basically, what you're looking at $50 a barrel onshore, the take to government and Petrotrin. Government is 12.5% royalty. Petrotrin is 7.5% overriding royalty. And then government take is the SPT, which is 0 at this price, and PBT and unemployment levy, which is 55% together of profits. So that comes up to $18.66, whereas the take to the company is $7. So it's significantly higher than the take to the company under the current regime. Now, look at what happens when the oil price goes above $50 a barrel. Government take increases because SPT kicks in. But then look what happens to the oil company. It drops to $4 a barrel, as opposed to almost $23 a barrel for government. That becomes very marginal. Now, if you go into the offshore, it's even worse. It's $15 a barrel, as opposed to 18, because of the higher operating costs offshore. And your profit, again, is going to be, take for the oil company is going to be about $2 or $3 less. So there's a huge disparity in all of these cases between the government take under the current regime and the oil company take. Now, when SPT kicks in offshore, look at what happens with the government take, and look at what happens here. The company is actually losing $4 a barrel. Now, Petrotrin is offering 3 offshore fields. Under the current scenario, and with the assumptions that I have used, people aren't going to put the money in there because they will do the same kinds of numbers that I'm doing and realize that once it's above $50 a barrel, they're going to lose money. So now let's go to the next one. I'm suggesting that there needs to be fiscal incentives in place for this thing to work. 1, leave SPT at 0 for any EOR project, full stop. 2, provide a 50% uplift for all capital expenditures on EOR projects. Currently, there's an incentive in place, as far as I understand it, for a 50% uplift for exploration wells. Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct? Right. So I'm saying do that for EOR projects. And similarly, provide a 50% uplift for the companies that are incurring the capital costs to supply the CO2. Give them an incentive to bring CO2 to the fields. Now, let's say that they listen to me and to us and say, okay, we are going to do this. And I'm saying we do this for incremental oil, not existing oil, because we're talking about EOR projects, which by their very definition, they're not really in the country at the moment, except the steam, and that's Petrotrin. Any new EOR project gets these incentives. Now, these are the other 4 cash flows. And what do we see? We're assuming that these things are in place. At $50 a barrel, government take is $16.81, not much different from what it was before, but the oil company take is $15.75, almost the same. At $51 a barrel, because SPT does not kick in, you're looking at, again, a more or less equal split between the government and the oil company. We're talking about a new pie here, and we're talking about a share in a new pie. We're not saying to government, change your regime for your current production. We understand, we all nationals of Trinidad and Tobago, we all understand the government needs to get revenue and can't afford to give up at this current time. So, in the offshore, even in the offshore, government take is higher, but in both cases, what we are seeing is that the onshore and offshore, we are looking at revenues to the oil company which make it worthwhile for them to go into the project. So, like I'm saying, it's a very equitable split, and it's part of a new pie. So we're looking at, if Donnie is correct, or I'm correct, anywhere between 15 and 50,000 barrels per day of EOR oil over and above the current 70,000, well, it's actually just under 60,000 barrels, because condensate does not attract SPT. So while it's counted as 8,000 barrels per day. So we're looking at almost double current oil, black oil production of new oil. So, what other changes do we need? And these are not just coming from Ministry of Energy, but also from other government agencies, Ministry of Finance, EMA, and Bureau of Standards. The current rules require companies to abandon their oil wells. With EOR, you need exactly the opposite to happen. You need to keep the wells in place so that you could implement your EOR. So what you do is you set your bridge plugs, your cement plugs, to safely plug off the zones that are open and suspend the wells until an EOR project comes in place. You don't abandon the wells, because then you're going to have to go and redrill, like a lot of people have to do in the States now. They have to redrill wells in old abandoned fields. So you don't want that to happen. In addition, you say, prepare your fields for CO2 EOR and sequestration. And you provide tax credits or incentives to the companies who capture, who purify, and who build the CO2 transmission systems and distribution systems. That way, you get companies coming in to do it fairly quickly, and you also provide some kind of a tax credit or incentive or uplift. I suggest 50% uplift for companies that are also sequestering the CO2 by collecting it in the field and recompressing it and putting it back into the ground. That way, 100% of the CO2 that comes into the field in the first place remains in the ground. That's the term that I had coined, dynamic sequestration. Now, when all of this is in place, that's the time that you can say to companies, we have an infrastructure in place to reduce and minimize CO2 venting to atmosphere. If you don't make your CO2 available, then you get fined, like is done in other parts of the world. But I am not saying that we should do this until the system is in place. Something I would like to suggest as well. I would like, let's say, if Petrotrin and the larger operators should work with the EMA to start applying now. Petrotrin should apply for a blanket CEC for EOR in all their fields. They do that now. By the time they award the blocks at the end of the year, the CEC will be in place. I'm saying this to you. I'm also going to make this suggestion to the chairman of Petrotrin and the people at Petrotrin as well, because to me it makes absolute sense. How does that sound to you? Yeah? Thank you. EMA should work with NGC and whoever else wants to build the pipeline systems to get a blanket CEC for pipeline systems throughout the country. It's very easy in the offshore, in the onshore. That's why I'm saying NGC. NGC will say to them, we will be using our pipeline corridors to facilitate the laying of these pipeline systems so that the NGC and the EMA and everybody else knows where these pipelines are going to go. So it's then very much easier to give a CEC. Again, if we do that and we start that now, by the time the CO2 is needed by the operators who are applying to Petrotrin to get fields, the CEC is in place for the EOR itself, and the CEC is also in place for the pipeline to bring the CO2 in. And we won't have to barge the CO2, perhaps at all. I think that's the end. So, thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, we can now go on to the panel discussion.